everyone. I hope you are all staying well and staying sane in our crazy new world. We're going to keep going with our lectures like this. Please let me know if this doesn't work. It's my first time trying to record lectures via video. So here goes. I'm going to share a screen with you all. Slowly. There we go. All right. I'm going to do this better though. Da, 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 da. Okay, we're all learning. I'll get better at this. So I wanted us to pick up where we left off. So remember like a year ago when we had that really fun conversation in class starting our love and sex module. It was so fun. We didn't even get to our lecture that day. So I'm going to go ahead and just pick up right at the beginning with this lecture in our love and sex module. So we talked about all kinds of fun stuff, personal stuff about preferences and partners and mating behavior. So we're going to start today just by going over some of the real basic stuff when it comes to mating throughout the animal kingdom. And then the next lecture on sexual selection, we're going to get more into like why you choose the mate that you choose. So let's go ahead and start here, just talking about mating behavior throughout the animal kingdom. So when we talk about animals mating, it can look very, very different depending on the kind of animal that you're talking about. And there are mating systems that these animals tend to sort of fall within. But the type of mating system that the animals use, it's actually a reflection of the resources in the area where they are. So remember in evolution, we talked about competition and there was things like water, food, mates, territory. These were all things that animals were competing for. This actually plays a role here as well. And we see different types of mating systems based on different types of resource aggregations. So typically in mating systems, there is one sex that's going to sort of drive everything. Which sex that is going to depend on the animal species as well as how the resources are clumped. But generally speaking, if you have resources that are evenly distributed, you're unlikely to have a mating system where one sex, either male or female, is going to dominate over those resources. But when you have resources that are either scarce or clumped, they're easy to protect, that's when you start to get either male or female territories and mating systems that are going to fall within those territories. Now, when resources aren't clumped, we end up seeing monogamy often. People love monogamy. It doesn't always mean what we think it means when it comes to the animal kingdom. It does mean one male and one female, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have mated for life. It might just be that they've mated for a breeding season, maybe an entire season, maybe a year. And in some relatively rare cases, it means that they've mated for a lifetime. However, even in those lifetime matings, we see something called extra pair copulation. These are cheaters. So even in our monogamous species, we find that they aren't actually monogamous often. There's two different ways that this can look. You can be a socially monogamous animal, meaning you two go to all the parties together, you're publicly a couple, but there's some cheating going on the side. Or you can be a genetically monogamous couple. In that case, that means all of the offspring are just from that pair alone. So it's interesting. There's a lot of this going on, research with birds and looking at the genetic monogamy within birds. You'll see some really interesting examples of birds. Actually, by the time you're watching this, you'll have already watched Dancing with the Birds and seen some real interesting bird behavior. So say those resources are clumped, and now we have one sex that's going to dominate this territory. And it's going to allow the other sex to participate, you know, as long as they get mates. So if you have one male with multiple females, this is called polygyny. And in this case, you're going to have a single male that is going to control all of the resources. And the single male will allow females to be in that territory and using those resources as long as he gets to mate with them. You tend to see pretty strict dominance hierarchies in societies like this, with dominant individuals getting priority to resources and priority to mating. And you start to see some really neat social behavior come from this type of a group. Polygyny is more common. Polyandry, a little less common. Polyandry is when you have one female with multiple males, and in this case, the females are going to control all of the resources. So this is a marmoset monkey, and this is one of the few examples of a polyandrous community. Now, when resources are not clumped, we have monogamy. And then on the other hand, we have promiscuity. So these are animals that they have no contracts when it comes to mating. So both partners can have multiple other partners. I don't remember if it came up in our discussion, but bonobos, that is what is on the screen right now. Those are two bonobos. And bonobos are as closely related to us as the chimpanzees that you all think of. Chimpanzees that you think of, those are pan-troglodytes. And then bonobos are pan-paniscus. But we are just as closely related. I personally think it's a conspiracy that no one talks about bonobos as much as they do. And I think the reason that they don't is because these animals are totally promiscuous. They are also a female-dominated culture as well. So they're matriarchal. They are the only other animal that has been documented having sex face-to-face like humans. So pan-troglodytes, they tend to resolve their issues through violence. They're very violent animals. Pan-paniscus, the bonobos, they solve their problems through sex. Male, male, female, female, doesn't matter. Everybody feels good at the end of the day. So these are your other closest relatives. All right, so that is how the major mating systems fall out. And of course, the purpose of a mating event is in order to ultimately have offspring. But how these offspring end up developing, it looks very different depending on the type of animal that we're looking at. So one option is that you can be an egg-laying animal. In this case, it's called oviparous, to be an egg-laying animal. And all of the development of that animal is going to take place within the egg itself. The egg is going to have a yolk, and that is going to be a source of nutrient for that developing animal. Once that yolk has been consumed, then it's going to hatch out, and it's going to hatch out in a stage that it can either find its own food. In some cases, you do have parental care that will help to find food as well. So our egg-laying animals are things like our fish are egg-laying, a lot of our insects are egg-laying, our amphibians and our reptiles and our birds are all egg laying. We also have two examples of very weird mammals that are egg layers as well. Our platypus lays eggs, and an echidna, which is like an Australian hedgehog, he also lays eggs. So that's one option. Your egg can look pretty different. We had talked about what came first, the chicken or the egg, and this can be a bit of a tricky question depending on semantics. There are different types of eggs. So a lot of our animals can have these real gelatinous types of eggs. And these are animals that are going to be dependent on water. The reason for that is without water, this gelatinous egg is going to just dry out, and then the little embryo won't have time to develop. So that's a constraint for this type of an egg. It's not a big deal if you're a fully aquatic animal, but if you're an animal that is trying to live on land at all, it's going to end up limiting where you can lay your eggs. So the evolution of the amniotic egg was a really, really important moment in evolution. The amniotic egg is like a chicken egg, where you have a hard shell and some membranes on the inside. The amniotic egg allowed an internal environment that no longer had the constraint of needing water. So now that shell and all those membranes, they're going to keep that embryo and the yolk nice and moist until they hatch out. So this allows animals to live completely on land and away from water. So our reptiles don't need any water, nor do our birds, nor do our two weird little mammals. So the next option is that you could give live birth. This is called viviparous. So in this case, all of the development is going to be happening within the uterus of the animal itself. Depends on the animal, ultimately what that young looks like when you have finally given birth. So in some animals, so a lot of our prey animals, for example, like picture a horse or a giraffe or a zebra, when they give birth, that baby is ready to stand up right away. And it has to, otherwise it'll likely get eaten. And then there's other types of animals like us that give birth to relatively the exact word is escaping me right now. They're not good at being little humans yet, right? Like they can't walk, they can barely see, they can't vocalize, except for those cries that would definitely attract a predator if you were out in the wild. They're not well developed. That's what I was going for there. So it depends on the species exactly what that young ends up looking like when they do ultimately enter the world. And then there's this weird kind of an in-between stage called ovoviviparous. So just smush those two words together. And in this case, you actually have eggs that the female creates inside of her body. And the embryo is going to develop within that egg for a time. And then it's going to hatch out of those eggs still within the female's body. So it makes sense as an evolutionary in-between to have this moment between being an egg layer and then giving live birth. So it's a little bit of a combo moment. We see this in a lot of sharks, actually. So the image that you were looking at here is baby sharks. And that big white mass that's attached to their body, that is an egg yolk. So they have hatched out before they've actually finished up that egg yolk. It's attached to their body, and they're still going to be using that as nutrients as they continue to develop and then ultimately be born live birth from the mom. So weird little in-between stage. So all of those modes were sexual types of reproduction. We do have some animals that are also going to use asexual reproduction as well. So some of our really basic animals like our sea sponges and our corals, they're going to do what's called colonial reproduction. And in this case, they basically have a timed event. Remember, we talked about timing being really important. A timed event where they're going to just spew all their gametes into the ocean at the same time. So the males will release all of their sperm, the females will release all of their eggs, and the hope is that they will meet and land somewhere and then create another sea sponge or another coral. This is really only a good strategy if you live in an environment that isn't changing much. One of the issues with asexual reproduction is that you end up with clones of the parents, and that doesn't lend itself to variation. And we learned that variation is incredibly important in natural selection. If there isn't a ton of variation in the gene pool, you're going to be really susceptible to diseases, or if there's any big shift in the environment, you're probably not going to have a wide range of traits that's going to tolerate that change very well. So another type of asexual reproduction, it's called parthenogenesis. This one is so weird. These are considered to be virgin births. So the female basically uses her own reproductive tissue to create offspring. So think back to our genetics talk where we use these terms diploid and haploid. A diploid animal is one that's going to have two sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. And haploid offspring is only going to have one. So in the case of parthenogenesis, it's just going to be the female's information. Remember again that we can all live with our X. Like I don't have a Y, neither do any of you ladies probably, and we're all fine. So it's okay to just have that half of a genetic material. You are going to lose variation again though. But parthenogenesis has been seen in sharks and reptiles and amphibians and fish. The picture down below, the lizard, it's a whip-tailed lizard. And this group is particularly well known for using parthenogenesis. There are actually no male whipped-tailed lizards. They are all female. The only way that they reproduce now is through parthenogenesis. They still perform mating behaviors, so female-to-female mating behaviors, and then they end up having these virgin births where they create clones of themselves. So super weird. Another really neat adaptation that some animals have is the ability to actually store sperm. So some animals have specialized compartments in their body where they can store sperm for the right time. This lets them choose to have offspring when resources are going to be most abundant and they're more likely to survive. It also allows for them to be ready to refertilize an egg the minute that the other set of offspring have been born, so they can continually have offspring if they choose to do that. So octopus has this, a lot of our reptiles, sharks and fish have this as well. So do some mammals. This is called delay implantation when we talk about it in mammals. Basically, we've studied this a lot in mice and rats, and you can delay the actual implantation of the egg in the uterine wall, which is when development is going to start to occur. So this has been studied a lot in our mice and rats, but it's actually been documented in over 100 mammal species. I'm actually being able to choose when they want to become pregnant, which is insanely cool. All right, so we've mated, we've got these different reproductive strategies, But how do we know if that offspring is going to be a boy or a girl? This is actually not as straightforward as you might think that it is. So in humans and in mammals in general, our sex is determined by our chromosomes. So that's X female, XY male. The number of chromosomes varies by species, as you can see below. Frog having 26, a chicken 78, human 46, a chimpanzee and a potato 48. I don't know why they throw in the potato, but that's pretty cool. But each of these animals are going, except for the potato, not an animal, they're going to have different ways that they ultimately determine the sex of their offspring. So birds too are determined by chromosome, but it's kind of the opposite as with mammals. So in mammals, it's going to be the male that determines the sex of the offspring, because where that Y ends up coming from is going to ultimately say boy or girl. Only the male has the Y to contribute. In birds, we actually use the letters Z and W. And a male is a ZZ, and a female is a ZW. So in this case, it's switched. And now our females are going to be the ones who are going to determine the sex of the offspring. In our insects, they have a completely different, strange way to determine the sex of the offspring. This is just honeybees as an example. So in our honeybees, you end up getting females if the egg is fertilized. You end up getting males if the egg doesn't get fertilized. So all the eggs end up going through development. The female is going to be diploid. So it's going to have both the mother and the father's genetic information. The male is going to be haploid with just that female's genetic information. So that's really fascinating here. So you can end up with bees from eggs that weren't fertilized at all. They're just going to be males. Our reptiles use a different strategy as well. With many of our reptiles, it's going to be determined by the temperature in which the eggs are laid. And there's different patterns. This isn't going to look the same across the board. When we look at sex determination in our turtles, in our crocodilians, and then in our lizards, we see different patterns in different species. So these two graphs that you see below are two examples of what this could potentially look like. So in the first graph, pattern 1, your x-axis is percent males, your y-axis is temperature. So the percent males is going to decline as your temperature increases. So in order to have more males, you're going to want to lay in a cooler time period. If you want more females, you're going to lay in a warmer time period. Pattern 2 is another possibility there. It's the same axes. And in this case, what you're seeing is that the percent males is a little bit more of a stabilizing selection pattern there, where they're not going to want it to be too cold, they're not going to want it to be too hot, but there seems to be a sweet spot there to get the maximal number of males. If you wanted females instead, you would lay outside of that maximal zone. So this is a really cool strategy. It'll be very, very interesting to look at reproductive success of reptiles as we continue to see changes in overall temperature in our environment. I imagine we're probably going to see it really affecting our animals like our sea turtles and our crocodilians. So we'll see. So some animals get to be hermaphrodites. This is a term that gets kind of thrown around quite a bit in popular culture. In order to be a biological hermaphrodite, you have to have functioning parts of both male and female. So you need to be able to produce sperm, and you need to be able to produce eggs. In humans, it's very, very rare to have a true hermaphrodite. You can end up being intersexed where you sort of have a little bit of both going on, but it's very uncommon for both to be fully developed, producing eggs and sperm. But there's a lot of animals that use this as a reproductive strategy. So there's some animals that can be both at the same time. Our annelid worms, we'll talk about those more in invertebrate diversity, but a lot of our worms have both eggs and sperm all the time. Our sea sponges and our corals. And then we have some animals that can actually shift throughout their life. So you can be protogynous, where first you're a female and then you become a male, or you can be protandrous, where first you're a male, then you become a female. So we see this a lot in coral reef fish. The wrasses in particular really like to do this. And it tends to be driven by the social structure of the animals in that particular group, where there's a dominant male and a dominant female. And if that dominant male were to die, that dominant female would then actually shift and become a male. And then the next female in line would then become the dominant female, and vice versa, depending on the scenario. So there's usually an environmental trigger or some kind of a social trigger in order to actually see this shift take place. This is a picture of a wrasse that you have on this slide, and you can see that they actually have pretty dramatic morphological changes too, right? Like they look like an entirely different fish from this top picture to the bottom picture as they are switching sexes. So that is a very cool strategy. All right, so that lands us at the end of the first lecture here. We will go ahead and move on to the next lecture, which is on sexual selection. I'm very sad that I won't get to do this one in person with you, but we'll do the best we can. Again, if there was any issues with this, say my audio didn't work and I was talking to myself the old time, please, please, please let me know. And again, I hope you all are doing all right, and I look forward to all of your feedback. All right, take care.